This week's episode of The Catch Up is sponsored by Foster's at the Fair. If you're planning to visit the Dutchess County Fair later this month, you should also plan on visiting Foster's at the Fair. Foster's is a great place to cool off and enjoy a full-service bar and indoor dining. You can also visit their beer tent with live music every night. Foster's is open every day during the fair until 10 p.m. Be sure to stop by and say hi to the Foster's crew. From the Daily Catch, this is The Catch Up, and I'm publisher Walter Mullin. The town of Rhinebeck is having a heated conversation about its future, and specifically about how much hospitality development the town can handle. Last Tuesday night, roughly 100 residents, business owners, and elected officials gathered at Rhinebeck High School for a panel discussion about the town board's proposed 9-month moratorium on new hospitality development. Business leaders and tourism officials made a strong case against the moratorium, arguing that hospitality and tourism are essential to Rhinebeck's economy and support many of the small businesses that make the community what it is. But supporters of the moratorium say the town needs to step back, gather data, and take a closer look at the impact of continued development. Our reporter Claire Greenburger was at the meeting, and she's here to help us sort through the arguments on both sides and explain what's at stake as the town board prepares to hold a public hearing on the proposal next week. It's the week of August 10th. Claire, nice to have you back in the studio.
Hi, Walter. Thanks for having me.
For people who haven't been following this closely, Claire, can you start by explaining what the town board's proposed hospitality moratorium would do and why the town board says it's necessary?
So the Rhinebeck Town Board is proposing a temporary pause on almost all new hospitality development in Rhinebeck. That would include new hotels, motels, restaurants, bars, farm tasting rooms, as well as other similar businesses. And if enacted, the initial moratorium would last 9 months. So during that time, no new applications could be considered by the town. The reason behind the law is that the town has seen a major uptick in hospitality development proposals in and around town in recent years, and town officials say they want more time to study how this kind of development is affecting the town. So they say they would use the time to do things like look at the environmental impacts of hospitality development and to consider whether the current zoning code is actually equipped to regulate these kinds of uses. And while the moratorium would start at 9 months, the board could extend it 3 times in 6-month increments, meaning it could ultimately last as long as 27 months.
Good. So let's just make a couple of points very clear for listeners. First, this proposed moratorium applies to the town of Rhinebeck, not the village. And second, there is an exception on the table to allow the development of the Linwood property to continue to move ahead. Is that right?
That's right. The proposal includes an exception that would allow the Linwood property, which for listeners who don't know is a 50-acre estate along the Hudson River in southern Rhinebeck. So that would be able to move forward as a hospitality venture if that's ultimately what the sisters who own the property decide to do. The exception isn't written specifically for Linwood. It's a provision that applies to all properties that the zoning administrator in Rhinebeck has determined have what's called a pre-existing non-conforming use, which Linwood received in March. However, I should note that while a few weeks ago it was really looking like Linwood was going to become some kind of hotel or hospitality venue, that may no longer be the case. The town is now considering a very different path for the property, which is to raise the funds to buy the land and turn it into a public park. So while the moratorium would not apply to Linwood, that may no longer be as critically relevant as it initially seemed to be.
Okay, good. That was helpful. So now let's go back to the meeting last week. The Chamber of Commerce's panel was clearly organized to make the economic case against the moratorium. What struck you the most about the argument the business community made that night?
There were a few things that stood out, and just for context, there were 3 local business leaders on the panel, Norman Greig, the owner of Greig Farm in Red Hook, Melaine Rottkamp, the president and CEO of Dutchess Tourism, and Jennifer Purcell, who's the dean at the Culinary Institute of America. And one of their main arguments was that hospitality and tourism brings a lot of money into Rhinebeck, and that generates tax revenue and helps support local services and infrastructure. They also argued that visitor spending helps sustain businesses like the many restaurants we have in Rhinebeck that probably couldn't survive on local customers alone. And while, traffic and parking issues may be a bit of a nuisance on holiday weekends, when visitors ultimately leave, which they do, locals get to have all these great businesses and restaurants to enjoy themselves. They also said there's a ripple effect that tourism can create. So having these great restaurants and businesses helps draw talent to the area. So one example they gave was doctors. So having a vibrant community can make it easier to attract good doctors who want to work at the local hospital, which of course benefits everyone who lives here. There was also a concern that if Rhinebeck limits new hospitality development, that visitors would just go to other parts of the Hudson Valley and spend their money there instead, and Rhinebeck would be losing out. So Melaine Rottkamp on the panel said, I don't want to wave goodbye to our money going across the bridge to everyone else. She said, I wanted to stay here in our community.
So one of the strongest themes from the panel, just to reiterate what you said, was that tourism and hospitality are the economic lifeblood of Rhinebeck. That's what the panel believed. How much evidence is there to support that claim? Do we have data on how much tourism really contributes to our local economy?
That's a good question because people would disagree about how strong the evidence is. Melaine Rottkamp did bring some stats to the panel, but they weren't hyper-local specific to Rhinebeck. She said visitors spend more than $2 million a day across Dutchess County and generate more than $98 million a year in taxes. And she also said that tourism-generated taxes save the average household about $850 a year, and that overnight visitors spend roughly 3 times as much as day trippers, which supports her argument for why having overnight accommodations in town matters. But some people in the audience felt like that data was not sufficient. They wanted numbers on things like hotel occupancy rates at Rhinebeck, which would show whether demand for rooms is actually growing, as well as numbers on how tourism growth would directly impact jobs and drive local employment. So there's good evidence that tourism is important to Dutchess County, but less data showing exactly what that looks like in Rhinebeck.
So let's drill down just a bit more about this other side of the argument. That's people who are saying the moratorium is important because, quote, we don't have enough data and we need to stop and study the impact of this development. Did you come away from the panel with a better understanding of what those people are really concerned about?
I'd say I did. After the panel, I asked some supporters of the moratorium whether they believe Rhinebeck could survive without its tourism economy, or whether they see a better alternative to tourism for Rhinebeck. And they said, pretty bluntly that they don't know. And they also felt that the panel didn't really have answers to those questions. So for them, they believe the town needs the moratorium to give it time to better understand these issues so that they can figure out what they want to do about hospitality.
Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. Let's say this moratorium does take place. It does happen. The town proves it goes forward. Does the town actually have a plan in place for what they're going to do to evaluate the situation? What are they going to exactly be doing during the moratorium period to gather this data? Do we know?
We don't know the exact specifics yet. I believe they're still being worked out, but from what the town board members have said so far, the process will include gathering some of the economic data that people feel is important and is currently lacking, as well as studying things like traffic, water use, and the environmental impacts of hospitality development. And the idea is then to use that information to inform future zoning laws.
Claire, I'm curious, is there one pending hospitality project that you think was the tipping point for the town board that may have caused them to take the action to propose this moratorium?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. There have been several hospitality projects that have been proposed in recent years. So I think it was really the culmination of all of these projects, not necessarily one in particular. I know that recently a group of local residents who live along Mill Road in Rhinebeck have been very concerned about the proposed taproom brewery. They think that the traffic on Mill Road is just going to become crazy because now we have Soho House on Mill Road, and there's also the possibility of Linwood, which is also at the end of Mill Road, becoming a hospitality venture. So I think it's just really seeing it's not just one, but several.
Claire, the proposed moratorium could be as much as 27 months if all the possible extensions are used. That's potentially a very long time for a business to wait. Do we know what particular projects could be affected if this moratorium takes place?
We know about these two projects that could be affected. One is Rhinebeck Villas, a proposed hotel project on 9G, which would be halted under the moratorium. And then another is, as I mentioned before, the proposed farm brewery tap room on Mill Road. The property owner said he believes that his project would be affected by this moratorium.
And then one more project. You spoke with Michaela Carpenter, who's preparing to take over the Rhinecliff Hotel down by the train station. What does this proposed moratorium mean for her specifically? And are there other existing businesses or proposed projects that you haven't yet mentioned that could face similar uncertainty?
So Michaela and her husband signed a 10-year lease this spring to take over and operate the Rhinecliff Hotel. She told me she's concerned the moratorium could potentially delay the hotel's reopening and that she hasn't been able to get a clear answer from the town about whether it would apply to them. So she's the only business owner I've spoken with directly about that uncertainty, but it's possible other businesses have similar questions about how the fine print of the law could affect them.
So I think what's interesting about what's going on is it's easy to see why people might be worried about a big project like Rhinebeck Villas coming in, but there's also the small business side of the story. So one thing I found interesting was the way that this moratorium could actually hurt small, locally owned businesses that we all want to protect in Rhinebeck. Can you explain the dichotomy of that argument?
So the argument is that Rhinebeck's small, locally owned businesses are actually a big part of the rural character that people in support of the moratorium are trying to protect. So, Rhinebeck has relatively few chain stores and a lot of independent shops and other businesses, but many of those businesses depend heavily on tourism. So the concern is that if you limit the visitors coming to town, some of those businesses may struggle to survive, and locals could ultimately lose one of the things they love about the town.
Interesting. Just a quick sidebar. I remember talking to a business owner in Rhinebeck Village recently who said when they didn't have the Sinterklaas festival last year, her business dropped incredibly that weekend. So Sinterklaas isn't necessarily a hospitality specific event, but in a way it is. So those types of things do support the small businesses. So back to the event last week, did the panel change the political landscape around this issue at all, in your opinion? In other words, did you get the sense that people who came in opposed to the moratorium were persuaded, or that people who supported it were moved by the business community's arguments? Do you think last Tuesday's event changed anyone's opinion?
I don't think it changed many people's minds. Deputy Town Supervisor Debbie Hecht, who voted to introduce the moratorium, came to the event, and she said she came in with an open mind, but afterwards I talked to her and she said she felt that the panel largely reinforced arguments she'd already heard. And, she described it as very chamber focused and business focused rather than an independent voice. And I think many of the people who came in opposed to the moratorium already sort of shared the panelists' concerns. So I'm not sure it moved the needle tremendously in terms of changing minds, but I think the event did have an impact in raising awareness. There were about 100 people there. So the discussion certainly put the issue on people's radar and may have energized people to get involved and express their opinion to local elected officials.
Good. Okay, so looking ahead, the town board is holding a public hearing next week on August 18th. That's open to anyone who wants to attend. So if any of our listeners or readers are thinking of attending that event on the 18th, Claire, what are the biggest questions that they should be asking themselves before they decide where they stand on the moratorium?
So I think the big obvious question is, has hospitality development gotten to a point where Rhinebeck needs to slow down and make sure it's not making decisions that it can't undo? And then the other big question being, is all of this interest in Rhinebeck actually a good thing? A sign of a healthy town that people want to visit and invest in. But then I think, for people who maybe find themselves a little bit more in the middle, who think that more information would be a good thing, I think the question that they should ask themselves is if that time is worth the potential trade-off. So, could Rhinebeck lose out on projects or investment during the 9 to 27-month moratorium? But in the long term, is that risk worth taking in exchange for having more information? So I think that's what people have to weigh.
Interesting. Well, listen, we'll be watching for your upcoming reporting on this. It's an interesting issue. Thank you so much for joining me today in the show, Claire.
Thanks, Walter.
That concludes this week's show. Thank you to our sponsor, Foster's at the Fair. If you're planning to visit the Dutchess County Fair, you should also plan on visiting Foster's at the Fair, where you can cool off and enjoy a full-service bar, indoor dining, and a beer tent with live music nightly. Foster's is open every day during the fair until 10 p.m. A big thank you to Maddie Rosenberg, Jen Hammoud, and Esther Martell at our partner Radio Free Rhinecliff for their help in producing today's show. We'll see you next time.